Lost Private. We're in Normandy.
Welcome, everyone, to the We're Not Lost Private podcast. I'm your host, Joe Muccia, and this is episode 15. We have our first repeat guest, James Daly, who appeared with us in episode 9 to talk about proposed airborne assaults during Operation Overlord. That was his first volume. And James, when's this next one coming out? Proposed airborne assaults in the liberation of Europe.
It's due out on the 30th of August in the UK. I'm not sure exactly about other countries. I think the US, it tends to be a little bit after that.
Yeah.
But sometimes it comes out earlier, sometimes it's a bit later. I think it depends on distribution and things like that.
Yeah, I've been chomping at the bit to get you back on and talk about this one because we've been exchanging notes back and forth on social media, and I've been following along on your Twitter stream, and you're always posting some really interesting documents. But first, you've been on the speaking circuit lately, haven't you?
Yeah. It's almost like I almost liken it to when bands release an album. You got to go out and tour. You got to go out and meet people. And yeah, it's great fun. I mean, I've been at the D-Day Story in Portsmouth. I've been to Army Flying Museum at Middle Wallop, which is a wonderful name for a village. Um, I'm at Fort Nelson Royal Armouries in a couple of weeks' time, and it's great. It's just great to get out and meet people and talk, and it's just all part of doing history.
Yeah. Did they record any of these sessions by any chance? And people catch up with them on one
Yeah,
of the
not
websites?
None of them have been recorded yet. No, and that's something I'll have to look at. Actually, I'll have to look at either getting one of them recorded or recording one myself. Yeah, that's definitely something for me to think about.
Yeah, well, hopefully this will be the catalyst to get some folks to come out to some of your talks that are local and can get there, because these are fascinating. This is a fascinating subject to me, and I know to a lot of our viewers and listeners the same thing, because obviously the airborne operations themselves, the ones that went off, are very much woven into the fabric of the history of the war, and they tend to generate a lot of interest because of there's a romanticism, I guess, built into them. These guys jumping in either daylight or nighttime jumps and, fighting these little isolated packets, and, paratroopers garner a lot of attention. And these operations, I think as we go through them, the proposed options a lot of folks will recognize a lot of the units that were earmarked to be involved with them. Obviously a lot of the well-known ones. But you cover 7 in particular in this book. Is that correct?
Yeah, this picks up where the last volume finished. The last volume finishes roughly with the end of the Battle of Normandy in the Falaise pocket. This volume we pick up from when the Allies are starting to head towards the Belgian, Dutch, German borders. So it's that what you call that breakout period up to the Battle of Arnhem.
Yeah, these are and unlike the, as we talked about prior to going live, unlike the ones that you had covered in your previous book, these are a little bit more well known to people, I think. They've heard a little bit more about them, whether it's just been urban legends or, in passing comments in other histories. I think people are going to be really surprised. One, I think they're going to be surprised that there were 7 of them laid on, or at least in various stages of planning. And
Yeah,
they had to
yeah.
cut us apart a pretty significant size planning cells to start putting all these together. Would that be
Yeah,
fair?
definitely. And I think if you factor in what we're talking about today is pretty much from early August to mid-September. So that's about 6, 7 weeks. 7 operations in 6 to 7 weeks. Not all of them are equal, so some have a lot more planning than others, but some of them overlap. So it's a lot happening in a very short period, and it is very much what you could almost say literally and metaphorically the road to Arnhem,
Yeah.
where you do start seeing a lot more of what happens at Market Garden starts to creep in very, very gradually, whether that's in the plans or whether that's in some of the command relationships breaking down, that kind of thing. It is literally the road to Arnhem in many respects.
Yeah, and I think one of the comparison points for me when I look at these, especially as well as you've laid them out in your book, the amount of time spent, and obviously Overlord is a massive operation with the airborne portions of it is just smaller components of. But the amount of time spent preparing for Overlord and for the airborne operations for the 101st, the 82nd, and the 6th Airborne going in, and then the other independent airborne units, to me, it just shows the disparity in the planning sequences, where you have months and months and months to prepare for Normandy, and then literally you have maybe a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks to prepare for some of these operations that they had proposed.
I think that's one of the really key things here, that D-Day, because of the set piece nature of it, and the fact that really it'd been 2 years, arguably longer in the making, that's a lot of time to think these things out, to line everything up. For Pegasus Bridge, for example, the oxen butts rehearse on a bridge they managed to find that's the same as Pegasus Bridge, pretty much. With Arnhem, that's just that the time window just doesn't allow for that kind of thing. So I think it does show that, one, First Airborne in particular almost have a thankless task before they even started.
Yeah.
Also, comparing D-Day to Arnhem in lots of respects is like comparing apples to pears, because they're extremely different contexts they're taking place in.
Yeah, the nature of them, instead of them being this supporting element to a larger attack, they are literally the lead elements in the attack, and then become the supporting elements as 30 Corps makes its dash up there. But before we get into all the nuts and bolts of the 7 particular proposed operations, you and I had talked briefly before we went on air about Brereton, and I really wanted to cover him because he's definitely an interesting character, and as we spoke about, ill-suited for the job that he's assigned. And I definitely wanted to get your thoughts for our listeners about what you thought about Brereton and his assignment, and maybe some of the positives of his tenure, and then also obviously some of the shortcomings, because we have to look at this in a complete light. We can't just whitewash the good, the bad out, and look at the good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, firstly, Brereton's job, if we separate the person from the job, that role was Marshall and Arnold in Washington were pressing Eisenhower to have an Army level airborne command. Looking at the records like I've looked at, I get the feeling that Eisenhower wasn't particularly bothered about it, but where he was very much a Marshall protege in particular, he felt that he had to. So having accepted that they needed that level of role, which had been discussed as far back as June, so First Allied Airborne Army doesn't just appear in August; it's a couple of months in the discussions. There's then a point of, well, okay, who's going to command it? And there's not really anyone suitable who's available. So lots of memos go back and forth between Schaeff and Washington about who are suitable candidates. Eisenhower sent Washington a list of 5 people he thought would be appropriate: Vandenberg, Cannon, and there's a couple of others, all of whom were, for whatever reason, not available. So Brereton wasn't even on the initial shortlist. So he's very much a compromise candidate as they work down who was available. By background, he's a tactical air general. He's not, to start with, he's not had any experience of airborne forces, but then we need to think that in 1944, not many people did. So that's not necessarily unusual. But we look at Brereton's diary is remarkably frank, and he records that when he was told that he was going to be given the job, I think he said he took a dim view of the appointment because he'd rather have stayed at 9th Air Force. Because if you're in the air, if you're an air general, tactical air is kind of where it's at. Being moved to what's effectively a transport command.
Yeah, he's kind of caught between a couple of different worlds there. I mean, obviously, you have the bomber mafia, and then you have your air transport guys, and you have your fighter command, and the tactical air forces is something that the British had spearheaded in North Africa, developing, having those forward observation officers at the forefront of the battle to be able to help control that tactical air force, and the the Americans were coming in hot on it and started to get very good at it. But obviously having modeled their command after the British efforts. And I thought, like you said, he's just kind of ill-suited because he's coming in from a command, and doesn't really have a right appreciation for the forces that he's going to be commanding. And he might have been, he might have been one of those guys that said, well, you know what, I have experienced commanders, and I'm going to rely on them to do all the heavy lifting in terms of the planning and the understanding of, air transport tables and how much weight can go on this aircraft and how many serials we need to have. He didn't seem to me to get himself involved in the minutiae of the planning. And when you're a general, you don't really have to, but you do have to have a grasp of it. And I don't think he did.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they even after he's appointed, he at one point a couple of weeks later, Eisenhower has to get Bedell Smith to write to Brereton and say, you do actually need to start doing your new job now. You can't just carry on. Because I think at one point Brereton actually asked Eisenhower if he could combine 9th Air Force with the Allied Airborne Army, because he didn't want the job. And I guess although in the military you go, ours is not to reason why, and you go where you're told. By the same time, somebody who out and out doesn't want the job, you've already got a problem, really, haven't you? Somebody who quite openly doesn't want to be doing it. That's not a good start, really, for such a difficult command.
Not only does he not want to do it, he doesn't understand it, and that's a pretty toxic cocktail to put in there. But despite his role or his lack of understanding, and they step out pretty quickly. Although I will say, from obviously you have June and into July, most of the airborne forces didn't get pulled out of Normandy until the July timeframe, especially on the American side, and that doesn't leave you a lot of time from July to August to absorb after action and lessons learned. Although at the tactical level, at the small unit level, they are, but I mean, it doesn't leave you a lot of time to do the bigger operational and strategic look at what went right and what went wrong and how to incorporate those changes into the newer planning.
No, and I mean the 6th Airborne Division, for example, don't leave Normandy until sort of almost late August, because they're even taking part in the breakout. And so Montgomery had a terrible habit of keeping airborne forces in the line much longer than they should have been.
Yeah.
Which one of the things that people don't think of is that 6th Airborne aren't going to sit down and write a detailed after action report until they've got out of the line. So that window's completely lost.
Yeah, and I think it shows in some of the planning. I mean, they don't have enough time to really absorb the lessons they've learned. I mean, again, it'd be at the tactical level. They figure out, like, changing up the parachute harness, or, for the Americans, the way the 30 caliber, instead of using a tripod, they use a bipod. Although there's still some of the men don't particularly care for the bipod, but it does give you a lower silhouette. So it's little lessons learned at the tactical level that come about pretty quickly, and the changes are made. But again, for the men that are making the plans, that are conducting the planning conferences, the most important lessons aren't really being absorbed and then incorporated in the plans. But I mean, by the time, let's see, when Lucky Strike, when does the planning begin for Lucky Strike? Because I know that was proposed for what, D+35?
Yeah, so Lucky Strike is actually something that's discussed well before D-Day. And as in common with a lot of these, supposedly we call them airborne operations, but actually they're part of a much bigger strategy. So Lucky Strike is discussed well before D-Day. What's going to happen once the Allies get a foothold in Normandy? So, when are they going to reach the Seine? Is it going to be a long hook or a short hook? That kind of thing. So Lucky Strike is very much several concepts. So you've got Lucky Strike A, Lucky Strike B, and so on, about how the Allies are going to do it. And a lot of that, even at that point before D-Day, they're starting to look at the possibility of landing airborne forces as a strategic, almost sort of pigging out territory for for the Allies to sort of link up with, and the area southwest of Paris is already being talked about for that. So Lucky Strike itself doesn't actually really get into any sort of momentum as an airborne operation, but Transfigure, which happens, which almost roughly 80 years to the day it's being planned and talked about, that is almost what you would call the embodiment of Lucky Strike. So Lucky Strike is a concept that's developed before D-Day. Transfigure is, okay, we're going to do this. This is where it's going to happen, and this is what's going to. It's the more detailed aspect of it.
Yeah, and that's in the Rambouillet area that was intended.
That is, yeah.
Yeah, and that's mostly Allied Airborne. I don't think if I remember correctly, the force structure didn't include either one of the U.S. divisions. Is that correct?
101st are in some versions of it, but we are in that territory where there's a little bit of debate about whether they're ready to go off on another operation yet. Obviously, they're trying to sort of hold back as long as they can. Other people are saying, no, it'll be okay. There is an independent US parachute infantry regiment. I think it's the 504th, who are available.
Yeah, they had pulled them out of Italy. They did not make the Normandy jump except for the Pathfinder elements. So the 504, and I know the 13th and 17th weren't ready to go by then. So
so I think 17th have arrived sometime in mid to late August, but they're not ready yet. They're sort of ready sort of later on in the autumn.
And then from Transfigure we have Axehead, right? So that's about D+90 was intended for that, and that's a support of the 21st Army Group.
It is, yeah. I mean, Axehead's another interesting one that was discussed well before D-Day. Montgomery asks the Canadian Army to plan this. Partly, I suspect, to give them something to do, because he didn't really rate Crerar, the Canadian general, and because sort of Dempsey was sort of fully involved in planning D-Day. So again, Axehead is very much a concept, really, of how do you cross the Seine, and it just happens that airborne is one of the options that's discussed. It's all very, very theoretical. So there's lots of, do you land on a convex bend in the river or a concave bend? How far beyond the river do they land? There are even discussions about there being a seaborne landing on the North Normandy coast to cut off the German retreat. So again, Axehead's a much bigger concept than just the airborne bit.
Conceptually, do you think a plan like Axehead eventually informs or influences the planning for varsity, since there's a similarity in the concept?
Yeah, I haven't, in all honesty, I haven't studied varsity in great detail, but it's remarkably similar in concept. You know, a big river that you've no option but to stop and work out how you're going to cross it.
As somebody who's worked in plans before, I can tell you, we loathe to throw everything completely out. You know what I mean? When you start doing, you work from concept to, to a certain point and stop in planning. There's an investiture of time that goes into it. And I can tell you they just from personal experience, I guarantee you the planners did not throw out, all of that stuff with that. And in leaving it in their archives or whatever, wherever their file cabinets for future reference conceptually. I know the terrain's completely different except for the river. But the idea of dropping them to seize the points on the opposite side to make the crossings easier conceptually sounds just like varsity. But
and there are lots of things in it where they talk about can we get DD tanks down? Can we get some LVTs, some minor landing craft? And these are all things that, again, as you say, completely pop up in varsity. You'd like to think would have been borne in mind for Market Garden, but doesn't seem so.
Yeah, considering how several of the ferry crossing was ignored basically up near Arnhem. I mean, there's a lot to unpack with that in terms of similarities and things of that nature. But from Axehead they go to Boxer, and that's near Boulogne.
Yeah, that's Boulogne. So I think the idea there is that would effectively just be a landing to capture some V weapon sites, because at this point the V weapons are really starting to tax the politicians, particularly in Britain, because after the Blitz in 1940, 1941 quietens down, there are still some individuals or bombing raids, but nowhere near as serious. So I suspect everyone thinks that we've got through the worst of it. And then in 1944, you get these doodle bugs coming over, and it has a big impact on morale. Not surprising, really. So dealing with these V weapon sites is a big strategic, more political imperative.
Yeah,
And a lot of them were in the Pas-de-Calais region.
yeah, and they're such a random weapon system. There's no, there's no precision to them.
Yeah,
It's,
and I think it's similar to the Stuka, where the noise they make as well. That's one of the things that people talked about. They would stop and then they'd make a screeching noise as they fell to. So it's a morale impact out
yeah,
of
it's a
proportion to
terror
their.
weapon essentially.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah,
they have to cut those sights off. In other words, to push them
yeah,
back out of range. It makes
yeah.
complete sense.
So Box has a very brief plan that there are some maps that identify potential dropping zones. They identify a couple of beaches that they thought might have been suitable for landings, but really it's just something that bounces around a couple of headquarters, and a few plans go back and forth. It doesn't really. I don't think it even reaches First Airborne Division. It's a very high level
Yeah.
thing, and that's actually something that happens with quite a few of these operations. They don't reach the divisions, so to speak, let alone the private on the airfield.
Yeah. And by the way, the maps in your book are excellent.
Oh,
Absolutely
great.
outstanding. Really love them.
Yeah.
The drop zone layouts, outstanding work. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Paul at Battlefield Design, if it's okay if I give a shout out, did a
Oh,
wonderful
without a
job.
doubt. Yeah, go right
Um,
ahead.
I sent some really some really amateurish sort of sketch maps with some annotations and things, and did a wonderful job of turning them into
Oh
a
yeah.
reality.
Yeah, they really pop.
Yeah.
They make it easy for you to sit there and visualize
Mm, great.
the planning. So well done. Pat on the back for him. And then Lynette or Lynette, am I mispronouncing it?
Yeah. Yeah, Linnet, I think. It's one
Tournay.
of the things with these pronunciations. I've got an idea what I think they are. I think it's linnet. It's a bird that's native to at least Britain, I think. Um, so linnet is where things start getting really interesting because Brereton's headquarters are now really up to speed and they've been activated. And the idea with linnet is it's a landing around Tournai in on the French-Belgian border, and you've
And
got
the
sorry, Joe.
yeah, the force structure was really robust from what I could tell.
Yeah,
101st, 82nd, 1st UK Airborne, Polish Para Brigade.
yeah,
I was very impressed at the force structure. I'm like, now this is an operation. This
yeah.
is
So it's the same Orbat as
yeah,
Market Garden.
yep,
Yeah. So I mean, the idea there is it's to capture some. There are some key rivers. So one of the things that keeps cropping up is rivers. In Belgium and Holland, particularly, are pretty much countries that are crisscrossed with rivers and canals. So it's to capture some key river crossing towns and crossroad towns. It was on the border between 12th Army Group and 21st Army Group area of responsibility. So I think there's an aspect of that there. But it's a very difficult, fluid situation because the Allies are advancing. I think 30 Corps are advancing sort of 60 miles a day at times. So it's really, really hard to know. I think we talked last time about this airborne paradox where it's got to be something that's risky enough to be worth doing, but it can't be too risky that they're going to get left behind.
and wiped out.
So
Yeah.
the window of opportunity for using them is so small, particularly when the advance is so rapid that they're actually having trouble keeping track of who's where on the map.
Yeah, and the
Um,
Germans are being battered all the way back. I mean, you end up having filet happening, and
mm,
the 15th Army kind of compresses itself up in northeastern
mm.
or northwestern Holland. I mean, all the way up at the coast. They end up falling all the way back and get pinned down up there. I mean, it's the advance is moving so fast, and this is the part of the urban legend everybody talks about. We're moving so fast and we're overrunning drop zones, but it really is accurate to what's happening, and you can
Yeah,
understand why these plans are getting turned off quickly. They don't even have enough time to get the forces briefed up before, and a
yeah,
lot of times they end up in the airfields and then have to
yeah.
get
Linnet,
recalled.
yeah, Linnet is one where they did get very close to taking off. So you've actually, I mean, Linnet, you've actually got two operations effectively, because Linnet one around Tournai, that the drop zones get overrun pretty quickly, and the intelligence was that there weren't really many Germans in the area anyway, which kind of makes you sort of think, well, it probably wouldn't have been worth it, and they might have only been on their own for a couple of hours at best. But then when that gets cancelled, Brereton unilaterally contacts Schaeff and says, don't worry, we can switch this to Liège, Maastricht, Aachen area. There's like a sort of triangle in between Holland and Belgium and Germany.
Mhm.
He says, don't worry, we'll switch it to there, which is the other side of Belgium. And he said, we can do it in 36 hours notice. And what really kicks off the problem here is his deputy, Browning, who's dual hatted as commander of the British Airborne Corps and Brereton's deputy, threatens to resign because 36 hours wouldn't be enough time for the airborne troops to be issued with the relevant scale of maps.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
Not to
and
mention
this is
you
where
have to
things really
configure
break down.
you have to configure your force structure. The terrain gets a vote, the enemy gets a vote. You can't pivot a massive airborne operation like that in 36 hours. It's just
Yeah, and
mind-boggling that he
I
would
think
suggest it.
that does show how little Brereton clearly understood, and the fact that he thought it might have been acceptable to send, 3 divisions plus in without adequate maps. I mean, I've been to Liège, that area. It's very sort of, it's the northern edge of the Ardennes,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
So it was
Lots
slightly
of
mad,
rolling
really.
hills, lots of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
waterways.
Again, rivers. It's a lot of industrial towns around there. So it's they wouldn't have been very wise. And I think what's interesting about the relationship between Brereton and Browning is that they clearly never hit it off. So
Yeah.
when Brereton first meets Browning, he describes him in his diary as dignified officer of the guardsman type, which feels very very sort of double.
I was going to
It's
say
hard to
it's
work
kind
out
of an
if that's a compliment
offhanded, left-handed
or an
compliment
insult.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So they clearly didn't hit it off.
To think about it also in terms of I don't think he was thinking in the best interest of his air crews as well, because unlike with, say, Market Garden, where they could swing out over the ocean and fly back, you're over the German occupied territory for a lot of that flight going in and coming out. I
Yeah,
mean, that's
yeah. That's deep in, isn't it?
right.
Down
And
down to there.
if you think about the fighter cover that went in Market Garden, if they were to run a similar, you know, mission set for that, I don't know how well that would have gone.
Yeah. And I think, and also as well, you're getting very, very close to the Siegfried line there as well, around Aachen and places like that. So I think it shows how little Brereton understood how little he understood airborne operations, because I don't think it would actually have been realistically possible if you think about all the
Yeah, I
things
mean,
you need to do about identity.
beyond the 36-hour issue,
Mm.
just the flight paths in and out would require quite a bit of fighter cover. Um,
Yeah,
and even then,
yeah,
fighters aren't going to stop flak. So,
no,
oh, they are,
no.
but they're gonna not gonna it's not gonna work out well for them.
Yeah, and this is another one of the problems with these operations where the airborne planning becomes increasingly dominated by Air Force officers. Quite naturally, in some respects, they're trying to find the perfect route in where they're not going to lose a single aircraft.
Well,
And
we know
that's
that's
probably
impossible.
naive because this part of Europe has had thousands of bombers flying over it every night for 3 years.
Mm.
So, of course, the Germans have got significant anti aircraft assets anywhere that's worth assaulting. So,
Yeah.
they weren't willing to accept a certain level of of losses. So
Yeah,
I mean that complicates matters even further.
yeah, I think the risk aversion component to that, along with I lost my train of thought on it. They yeah, the risk aversion piece is a big part of that. But I think also they you have to understand the limit on how many airframes they have available, and this affects Market Garden obviously because of the multiple lifts that they have to use, and then we won't get into Browning's part of the lift going into Osterbeek because that's
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, or Grosbeek. That was yeah. But what how fast did they pivot from Linnet to Infatuate? I mean,
Um,
is it
so
fairly
infatuate is something that's fairly conceptual. So obviously the British have captured Antwerp, but critically didn't advance a few more miles and cut off the peninsula. So although they held the port, they didn't hold the approaches to Antwerp. The Scheldt
the
were
Scheldt? Yeah,
still in German hands, so the port was effectively useless until that could be cleared. And there is a little debate going on in particularly the British command about Antwerp versus the Rhine. I think, to be honest, I think most of the generals saw their names in lights and the Rhine rather than Antwerp. The one person who was an advocate for Infatuate was de Gongen, Montgomery's chief of staff, who actually, quite like Dempsey, often actually seems like much more of a thinker and much more perceptive than he's often thought of in the histories. So he sent letters to Montgomery several times saying, "How about using First Airborne Division at Walcheren?" Which strategically is shows that he was thinking about the logistics picture and about making the most of Antwerp. The problem with Walcheren is where much of it is below sea level. It's very prone to being soggy. So, I mean, they would be at real risk of landing in flooded water, or the Germans could have just flooded the island. And it's actually not a huge area, so the risk of overruns and things like that, it doesn't get anywhere near the airborne forces. Infatuate is something that gets batted around a little bit between de Gongen and Montgomery, and it does get picked up a little bit later in October when they are looking at doing Infatuate properly. But by that time, Walcheren's been the dikes have burst and it's flooded, and
flooded everything. Yeah,
it's just not feasible.
yeah. I think you touched on something. There was Sir Freddie there. To
Mm,
me, he's one of the unsung heroes of mul of if you look across the breadth and width of the staffs, there are multiple unsung heroes. I think he's one of them. Not only is he a very sober thinker and an excellent planner, he is also very good at mitigating or moderating Montgomery at times. Uh, and to his credit, I think he probably keeps Montgomery from getting fired at one point.
yeah, I think more than once. I think he probably does on specific occasions, but in general, I think it's interesting. Al Murray and James Holland's podcast recently, they had a show where they talked about how de Gongen effectively has the poor chap has a nervous breakdown every few months and has to go off on leave because he's dealing with such a difficult job
Yeah,
and such a demanding sort of boss.
and he
And
realizes he is the go-between a lot of times, and he
mm,
does a lot of shuttle diplomacy between the headquarters, and then he
yeah,
convinces Montgomery at one point to write that letter of contrition to
mm,
Ike, which basically saves him.
yeah,
Uh,
De Gongen in all the records I've looked at looks like a very sharp thinker.
I thought he was brilliant,
Um,
actually. Yeah,
yeah,
from what
very,
I've looked
very,
at,
very perceptive, very switched on, I think.
had a very innate feel for the battlefield. He had innate feel for people.
Yeah.
That he was a good problem solver. He could step back.
Mm,
Like I said, a sober thinker. He'd pull back a little bit, open up his optic to understand what was going on, and then
yeah.
really applied sound judgment more often than not. Um,
Yeah. And the fact that he was thinking about Antwerp and Walcheren and the Scheldt when everyone else is looking at the Rhine,
yeah.
you'd have to say that history showed that that was quite sensible, really.
Yeah, and there's going to be some stuff coming out on Walgreens soon because I know Stephen Fisher is talking about he was going to do a book on gold, and now I think he's pivoted. Friend
Yeah, I
friend of
think
the
so.
show. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm waiting to get my copy of Sword. I can't wait. But
Oh, it's really good. It's very, very good.
yeah. Well, back to you though. So I mean,
Yes.
how quickly did they spin off of Infatuate? Would you say it was only a couple of weeks before they turned it off based
Yeah.
on what was going on in the area?
Yeah. I mean, Infatuate, it's almost like the Gongan sends the memo to Montgomery, and we've got no record of what Montgomery said back, if anything. So it almost like it's almost like in fact de Gongan's idea about Infatuate sort of just falls on stony ground.
Hmm,
It just
some deaf ears.
yeah, it falls on deaf ears because they're fixated on looking to the east. I suspect after the rapid advance they've had, it you can kind of see why they were looking further. I mean, at one point in late August, Montgomery sets the inter-army group boundaries,
Mhm.
and he lines them up as far as Brunswick, which is like sort of halfway to Berlin. So that shows how far ahead they were thinking and how ambitious
Yeah, I think
things were. So it's often a bit of a cliche in Bridge Too Far where they talk about the war will be over by Christmas,
yeah.
but there is evidence that they were kind of thinking a little bit like that.
Oh, without a doubt. And I
Mm,
think you can see that across the multiple headquarters that were lining up um, when it finally ends up, leading to where they eventually they outrun their logistics tail. And not only that, you've got a lot of units that have been ground down that have to reconstitute, and they end up suffering. The Battle of the Bulge is probably a stepchild of that mentality.
yeah,
But I definitely think you touched on a very important point was they all had their eyes on the Rhine. But the thing is, without Antwerp, that logistics line still stretches back to Normandy.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. And it's amazing what they were able to achieve with the Red Ball Express and
but they were
Mulberry
using,
Harbour
but
still.
but they were using so much fuel for the Red Ball Express. They were using almost as much as they were transporting at times,
Yeah,
and it really was outrunning its utility the longer they had to keep it in operation. So Antwerp had to be,
yeah,
I'm. It was interesting seeing Infatuate when I started paging through and doing my homework for this.
mm,
Um, but I think speaking of the stepchild, obviously Market Garden is the stepchild of Comet. Um,
yeah,
and Comet is just a much more modest plan in terms of its size, its scale, and its ambition as to what it morphs into later on. But I'm sure everybody would like to hear what the if you can give like the contrasts or how one begot the other, that would be great.
sure. So Comet um, starts off being planned, and when Linux cancelled, Comet starts being planned in early September, and the target is for 8th of September. And the initial plan is for 1st Airborne Division plus the Polish Brigade to land around Graf, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. So the 4th Parachute Brigade would land at Graf, the Air Landing Brigade would land at Nijmegen, and the 1st Parachute Brigade would land at Arnhem. Polish Brigade would land as a sort of divisional reserve. And interestingly, Browning's Corps headquarters would land. Not quite sure why, because it's a division plus a brigade, which at Arnhem, Urquhart would have just taken under command anyway. So it'd only been the size of an American division anyway.
So there's no need for a Corps headquarters, even
Yeah,
for
there's no
coordination
need.
above.
No, but again, it sort of gives lie to this idea that Browning just wanted to get into action. It's not hard to, even if you're looking for reasons not to think that, it's very hard not to, because the evidence just suggests that it would, yeah, and as we've discussed, it took glider lift away from other things.
Yeah, more important
Um,
things. And then,
yeah,
there's a series of operational and tactical decisions that get made there that really kind of, yeah,
yeah,
really,
and
really stunt Market Garden
yeah,
early on. That and the losing
yeah,
of the Son Canal Bridge down in Eindhoven
yeah,
really kind of sets it back way on its heels. But anyway, back to Comet. The force structure much smaller.
Yeah, so it's much smaller, and I think one of the things is that lots of veterans in particular have said, well, if Market Garden was a disaster, Comet would have been even worse. But I think what people tend to overlook is that at this point in the campaign, a week was a very long time in terms of the Germans' position. So I can't, it's difficult trying to work out the exact dates, but I think even as early as September, they were still dribs and drabs. But in early September, there was this process of forming Kampfgruppen and blocking lines and just, ad hoc units. So
I don't think they coalesced to a size that would have been. I mean, you still had the two divisions pulling back, the retrofit and the two armored divisions up north, but I mean, really, the rest of the was literally a rabble coming back.
Yeah, and of
Some
course,
units not even having weapons. It was
yeah, and I think the thing is, the Germans are really always really good at reacting very, very swiftly. This sort of theory of the doctrine of the immediate counterattack. But if you've got sort of even Kampfgruppen, there's no unit cohesion. So I think we don't know how, we can't just compare Comet to Market Garden in that sense, because the the other side of the hill, so to speak, even a week to 10 days earlier would have been very, very, very different. And I think at one point, even one of the German commanders, I can't remember who, said if the Allies could literally have cycled to the Rhine on bicycles and we wouldn't have had anything to stop them in early September. So Comet, in one respect, would have been at a more ideal time than Market, because the Germans were in such a state of flux. Whereas by 17th of September, they've managed to form some sort of defensive lines.
Definitely could see that, obviously, because a lot of the units had a lot more cohesion at that point than, like you said, in early September. Do you think that the smaller force structure was just because it was going to be an all British and Polish show, or because was it an airframe, a lack of airframes to deliver it? Or was there how was the planning at Brereton's headquarters for this? I mean, because it's obvious they had, did not envision having the US units involved. So what was driving that?
So what the Comet was being driven very much from a British perspective. So it was asked for by Dempsey and Montgomery, and then First Allied Airborne Army are then effectively the sort of contractor, so to speak, and Montgomery and Dempsey are the clients. I think at that point, my feeling is that they thought that a division plus Orbat would have been enough. I think that's probably because when it comes to Market Garden, we know from the discussions between Montgomery and Dempsey and Horrocks and Browning that because the front line had started to harden, the division plus wouldn't have been enough. Therefore, they needed to scale it up. So I don't think it's so much that there were any sort of political or national reasons for it. I think they just thought that would be enough to do the job.
That would suffice to do the job.
Yeah.
Now, I always ask the folks that come on, and I think I asked you when you came on in the last episode, was there anything in your research that surprised you, that caught you off guard in terms of the information you were discovering?
Comet in particular, and I had read this before, but I'd almost lost it from my mind. I found a map, Grace, of Comet that showed glider coup de main landings at Graf, Nijmegen and Arnhem bridges. Now, that's something that's been debated very hotly in the history of Market Garden about why they didn't do it after it worked so well in Normandy. And there are lots of reasons given about the Air Force not wanting to fly too close to the bridges, the terrain not being suitable. So that's what they fought for Market Garden on the 17th of September. But it was considered okay for Comet on the 8th, 9th or 10th of September. So that's some quite fundamental shifts in thinking in a week. Now,
Do you think it's the finally get the air component planners get a heavier voice at that point?
yeah, I think so. I think that, and that would fit in with the general trend of how
Risk
these
aversion.
operations are being laid on as beautiful air operations that just happen to have some blokes jumping out of planes at the end of them. That would be the general trend. That it fits in the general trend of that about the air aspect is um, primary. And there are, in the British experience, there are some reasons for that because early in the development of British airborne forces, the army had to effectively let the RAF have a veto over whether operations happened or not,
Mhm.
because the RAF weren't really interested in airborne forces. They were just trying to build as many bombers and fighters as they could. So there are some deep seated inter-service reasons for it, but you can see between Comet and Market Garden, this is where a lot of these factors all start to align, and not bad luck, but lots of these errors all start to coalesce at the same time.
Yeah, there's definitely seemed to be a slice of the personalities on all parts of the Allied command that did not have any love for the airborne mission type and then the assets that it tied down to execute them. So it's always interesting to see and read about these plans. And I think you've done a wonderful job in laying them out. This is really, I've said before, your previous book, I said this is some very cutting edge research that you've done and some excellent writing and put it all in a nice concise package for even the passing World War II reader. Just fantastic work again. Any speaking engagements coming up soon?
Yeah, I've got I'm at the Fort Nelson at the Royal Armouries, which is quite near Portsmouth. It's an old 19th century fortification built to defend Portsmouth from the French in the 1860s. So it's always great to go and talk there.
When is
And
that going?
that's on the 21st of August.
Okay,
So if you
wonderful.
check out their website or social media, that'll have details on. I don't think I've got any other physical talks booked at the moment, but some irons in the fire. So if you keep an eye on my social media, anything that comes up will be announced on there.
Definitely. And when can we expect the second volume out?
Yeah, so it's out on the 30th of August in Britain.
Beautiful.
I don't know about other countries. That depends on the distribution in those places, but
Who's the
hopefully it
publisher
won't be.
again? Who's the publisher
It's
again?
published by Frontline Books, who are an
Front.
imprint of Pen and Sword, and I
Okay,
think it's distributed in America by Casemate, I think.
wonderful. I'll make sure we get those links out for everybody. Um, I just want to say it's been a pleasure having you on again. I always enjoy these talks, and I definitely recommend everybody following you on Twitter, especially because and your Facebook if they can find you, because the postings are excellent. James posts snaps of the actual documents, so it's not like you're just reading somebody punching keys. These are the actual documents that he has found and taken pictures of from the archive. So I highly recommend following him. You can find the We're Not Lost Private podcast on YouTube and Spotify. We're now on Apple Podcasts and Amazon as well. And you can find us on Buzzsprout. We're on Patreon. If you are so inclined and you become a Patreon subscriber, it's $3 a month. You get all the pods, you get all the video hits, behind the scenes, a sporadic newsletter, and just stuff that I think is interesting to our listeners and viewers that I end up posting and writing up little blurbs about. But James, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I thank you all my Patreon subscribers, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you and following you again on social. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Joe.